The following presentation was given at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Tupelo in Tupelo, Mississippi. All are welcome to join us on Sundays at 11 a.m. at 1301 Marshall Street in Tupelo.
So I'm going to start with a little once upon a time sort of story, as you know I like to do, and tie things in as they seem to be tied into me, because a lot about being cunning has to do with tying things together that may not quickly and easily seem to be connected in any logical way. So once upon a time in my former life, I was an environmental journalist in Washington, D.C. Now, I like some things about my job, but I was definitely not following my bliss, as the then wildly popular mythologist Joseph Campbell told us was key to having a happy and fulfilled life. It was in the early 1970s, and I was studying the psychology of Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, and steeped in Joseph Campbell's books about the hero's journey and learning to live mythically and so on. The idea of going to seminary had occurred to me in only the vaguest way, mainly because my best friend from college seemed to think that studying religion might be a good way to pursue my wide-ranging interest. At that point, my interest in all these subjects was kind of abstract and analytical. And then one magical day, all of that changed. I walked into my favorite bookstore in D.C., which is still there, Kramer Books and Afterwards, and one of the booksellers there, who knew my strange habits and interest, pointed out a paperback novel and said, "You might enjoy that. It's kind of a Jungian novel." It was called Fifth Business. So I bought it and went home and started reading. I read the whole book in one night, loved it totally, and noticed at the end that it was the first of a trilogy. I'd had no sleep and figured I wasn't going to be getting much work done anyway, so I called in well and went back to Kramer's and bought the other two books. And over the next week, I pretty much read those and bought everything else he'd ever written that I could find. So the writer of this book that caused me to potentially risk losing my job was Robertson Davies. Very distinguished-looking gentleman who looked kind of like we might like to envision God if we think in anthropomorphic terms. And this is still the Fifth Business is still the book for which he's the most famous. So what this book and the others of his that I read did for me is they took the abstract of concepts that Carl Jung and Campbell and others had talked about, like finding your bliss and your destiny, examining things like fate. Is there such a thing? Are we fated to be, sort of one kind of way or another in our life? Examining phenomena like synchronicity, suddenly unexpected coincidences that seem to connect us up in some weird and mysterious way with larger forces in the universe. Concept about healing, both medically and through enhancing of the mind ways like meditation and laying on of hands and things of that nature. It took archetypes like fool saints, goddesses, priestesses, hermits, things like from the tarot cards, and it fleshed out these theoretical concepts that I had been so taken with and applied them to actual people and actual events. Now, as I said, Davies was a prominent Canadian novelist, won lots of prizes and so on. He also had been an actor, a professor, and a newspaperman. So he was a man of the world as well as a man steeped in sort of intellectual abstractions. He had indeed read and been exposed to, as I learned through doing a little research on him, to many of the thinkers that I was interested in. He had a fascination with comparative religion, and he was active periodically in various forms of Anglican communities up there in Canada, which of course is the church that's similar to the Episcopal Church that we know of here in the United States. Now eventually I got to see him in person. And most of my friends at the time thought of me as, I was working with a lot of younger people, so I was seen as sort of an elder and a woman of, shall we say, some cynical perspectives. I went to the reading he did in Boston, where I was at the time, with some of these young people, and they saw me turn into something between a groupie and a disciple. I just found him, his very presence filled the room with literally an aura. It was something that said between a rock star and a saint. I just wanted to crawl up in his hair and live there on his shoulder. This is not something I tend to do easily. I'm not a person who follows gurus or teachers. I was just enchanted. He seemed to be kind, clever, funny, understanding, forgiving, like he would be infinitely patient and have wonderful advice to give me on every subject, from his profound immersion in both books and people. I felt myself in the presence of someone who affected me the way the Pope might affect a devout Catholic, or someone might feel in the presence of the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh, or some other guru of another tradition. I knew at the deepest level of my being that this man knew things I did not know and that I wished to know. As I said, the friends who I dragged with me saw me as being a bit of a cynic and even a bit of a know-it-all, and they were impressed by him, but even more amazed at my awe of him, since I was famous for being pretty unimpressed with even the luminary professors at Harvard and so on. One friend said, "Gail, I've never seen you like this. It's like you're under a spell." And indeed, I was. I was under the spell of a cunning man. His presence affected me the way his books had, and they made me feel like I was looking at the world in general and individual lives in particular from a very different perspective. A higher, broader, deeper perspective, sort of a God's eye view, if you will. At the time I saw Davies in person, he had yet to write his last novel. The novel would give me this name and a better framework for what he was. In 1994, he died at the age of 82, and that same year he published The Cunning Man. Now, my previous exposure to the term cunning had primarily been associated with Odysseus, the hero of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The hero who had the good sense not to want to leave home and his lovely wife Penelope and his budding young son Telemachus and his beautiful land in Ithaca and go and fight a war that was really not his concern. He had tried all sorts of cunning methods, including putting his own son in harm's way, and nothing had kept them from recruiting him and taking him off with them to Troy. But then you may remember that it was Odysseus who finally came up with a scheme of building the Trojan horse that was hollow inside, where some Greek warriors could hide out and they could pass it off as a gift of homage to Troy. It got rolled through their gates, and late at night, when all the Trojans were celebrating their great victory, the Greek warriors came out of the horse and took over the city. And then you probably know that in the story of the Odyssey, it is Odysseus' 10-year journey back home where he gets seduced by women, falls into danger with the Cyclops, the great one-eyed giant, and again uses his cunning, his stealth, his wily ways to eventually worm his way out of all of those obstacles. And finally, he is one of the very few named Greek heroes who comes back from the war and his journey alive. Now, what Odysseus was a careful observer. He saw contradictions in the big picture and the connections as well. So this is what I learned from Odysseus about cunning folk. They see things and see possibilities and ways around obstacles that other people simply don't see. And so when I read this book, The Cunning Man, I realized that that was the definition of cunning that Robertson Davies was grappling with, not the definition that we sometimes see first in our dictionaries of cunning being about being underhanded and devious and a liar. Although some lying and some deviousness is often involved in being a successful, cunning person. So what does this have to do with being Unitarian Universalist? Well, we as Unitarian Universalists are in an awkward position in the culture. You know, we are a great minority. And now in the current culture of our country, we are probably a greater minority in some ways, not just numerically, but in our thinking of being open to lots of possibilities than ever, because we're living in a time where too many people, and I say this as applying to, well, I won't even use the word both sides, because we all know now we have multiple positions. We don't really have a two-party system anymore, really. Technically we do, but we have 4 to 6 sort of political affiliations that are all out there and competing for attention, and often are being equally oppressive in some respects. So we're living in a time where being sort of determinedly open-minded and a bit agnostic on all issues is not looked upon favorably in almost any circle that's kind of institutionally based. I have a son who's a little further to the left politically than I am, and I feel just as oppressed by him as I do by some of the kinds of people that we all run into daily down here. Keeping an open mind these days is truly not fashionable, but I think is, as you all probably would agree, more necessary than ever. So this is the time that we need to embrace the wisdom of people like Robertson Davies and learn how to be cunning. It's a time that we need to be open to lifestyles and studies and decision-making that may not seem right away to be the most logical or the best one. It's a time that we need to be elusive and maybe a little secretive as we try to figure out strategies for our survival and the survival of the planet and of forms of government that can serve for the largest number of people. Cunning folk, according to Robertson Davies and from the lesson of Odysseus, tend to be survivors. They take in everything. They are not hot-headed or quick to action. They do not judge harshly, but they're also not easily taken in. Cunning folk tend to love beauty, to see humor in many things, and to have a sense of irony. Oh, this is such an uncultivated quality these days. Essentially, they strive to have both knowledge, i.e. information, and hopefully a fact or two here and there, and wisdom, the ability to distinguish between facts that are more and less helpful. When they achieve a very high degree of cunning, their very presence in the world can be healing. Now, when I saw Robertson Davies in person, after having read his work, which I was already in love with, I realized that he reminded me of a very key figure in my own life, my grandfather. My grandfather didn't have a big flowing beard as Davies had, so it didn't look quite as much like the kind of Old Testament sort of God figure that, you know, a lot of people that take the scriptures totally literally might have had, who look at God in a very anthropomorphic fashion, but he had this presence, which I don't know even how to describe it, but I will tell you, if you have met such people, and I hope everyone has at least had some sort of encounter with a person like this, boy, do you know them. It's the kind of person who can sort of walk into a room where a lot of unpleasant things might be going on, and without saying one word, somehow just by their presence, things smooth out and get better. I found out later Carl Jung has a description that fits this kind of personality. He called it the archetype of the rainmaker. He noted that in native cultures, which Robertson Davies had been very influenced by, and in which his character in this book, Dr. Hulla, who became a physician, but a very unique kind of physician, had also been influenced by the native cultures of Canada, Native American culture. He realized that this is the kind of culture that gives us a sort of balance, and that these rainmakers that are noted in those cultures that help to relieve the droughts, like the little girl in our story, they don't really do anything. They just are. Their presence, Jung called that of a mana personality, a sort of personality that is just naturally giving. My grandfather had that personality. He had been mayor of Nettleton over here for years, and long after he was not officially in office, people of the whole range of political and social stations in that town looked upon him as sort of a village wise man. He too could have been seen as a cunning man. Now, the character of the cunning man in the novel is unique. He becomes a physician. He learns in this school where he mentions first learning the act of being cunning in the face of school politics and bullying and all sorts of things that we know have always happened in school and are not unique to the current culture. He learns how to get by and in a way kind of hide himself. And then he eventually goes to medical school and learns all the traditional tools of medicine, but then he begins to learn that his other kinds of wisdom gathered from tribal exposure and other kinds of reading that he did are also helpful. So he becomes that unique doctor who is a splendid diagnostician without having to send you for $20,000 or $30,000 worth of very expensive test. It doesn't mean that, of course, he wouldn't do that sort of thing, but he used taking the larger context into his mind as a way to give him extra tools. He would go and visit his patients in their home. So what did that do? It gave him a sense of the context out of which their illnesses were arising. One could see something, obvious things like, mold or poor conditions or bad food. He took their stories, not just the stories of their physical symptoms, but of all the other feelings that they were having, their anxieties, their fears, their economic challenges. And he determined that all of these things, at a time before anything resembling holistic medicine was even a notion in people's heads, that all of these things were factors. And he factored that into how he thought about his diagnosis and how he dealt with prescribing treatment. Now, this kind of holistic thinking can apply to anything, not just to being a medical doctor. Obviously, it applies to mental health, where we don't necessarily have to stay stuck with one school of psychological thought, but can realize that some people come in and they just don't fit the symptoms or the way we have been taught to perceive it by whatever our training was. Sometimes we have to go out of our normal training and read some different psychologists, some different perspectives, in order to gain the tools to deal with a particular case. It applies in education. Not all kids learn the same way. So many children are diagnosed now with various learning disorders who perhaps just haven't found the right thing to focus on, haven't had the right kind of intervention, and maybe do not need to be put on Ritalin or other kinds of medications. Perhaps there are other ways, but those ways take time to discern, and we live in a busy world. So when I was a full-time minister, and I happened to serve, as I think I've mentioned before, in a particularly interesting congregation that had some qualities that were quite different to what I had been trained at Harvard was the norm for Unitarian Universalist congregations. I just happened to stumble on a group where there were a minority of people that were highly educated, where a minority of people were readers. And I think I've said this before in different ways. I had to learn some new skills. I had to, for example, start watching television. I think I've maybe said this before. I have watched more bad TV than almost any intellectual in the country, because for years I had to watch it to find analogies and examples that I could use with the particular folks that I was attempting to serve. I know more about the Kardashians than I really would ever want to know. And other people, I mean, you could not believe the amount of bad television I've watched over the last 20 years. But it has not been entirely a waste of time. As I said, it gave me things that I could use in my ministry. I also started studying different forms of psychology myself, because although I didn't do therapy, I was often asked to do what I call triage kind of counseling. People would come to me with different, complaints, and I would have to figure out maybe what kind of help they might need. I couldn't provide it because I wasn't trained enough or licensed to do so, but I did learn enough to be able to help a lot of times get somebody to the right kind of intervention. So the thing about becoming a cunning person is it's hard. It takes time. And honestly, another thing that I learned from Robertson Davies, sometimes the only people that are willing and able to take that kind of time and therefore take on the sort of office of attempting to be a cunning person is somebody who doesn't maybe have a real traditional lifestyle. Having a partner, especially a demanding partner or one with special concerns, having children, all of these things can take up a lot of time, and they can take time away from the effort needed to become a kind of classic cunning man or cunning woman. And so I noticed that many of the protagonists in Robertson Davies' books tended to be people that were kind of more observers of life. They might have a career, but not a partner, or vice versa. There were often people who were not the people that we tend to first think of as authority figures. But I think that regardless of what our lifestyle is, that the aspiration to be a cunning man or woman is a uniquely Unitarian Universalist kind of aspiration. It might be a better word than the Eastern word enlightenment, and certainly better than the Christian term salvation, or being saved for what we want to be. We Unitarian Universalists at our best try to see the world whole. We want to see the very web that we talk about, the web and its interconnectedness, as clearly as possible from the limited vantage point of a single human life. Surely, therefore, it would be a very laudable goal for each and every one of us in this room and Unitarian Universalists around the country and the world to want to become a cunning man, woman, or some of us are in between there. It is a very laudable goal to become a cunning person, a person whose very presence can make a room better. And if enough of us could make a room or a group or a family a gathering better, that would in combination help make our world better. So perhaps better than some of the things that we're currently doing of name calling and being keyboard warriors, we might do better to spend more time on self-cultivation and getting us to that place where we too could become a man of personality, a cunning person. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the UUC of Tupelo's podcast. You can find us at uuctupeloms.org, on Facebook by searching for UUC Tupelo, or contact us by email at uuctupelocom@gmail.com. That's uuctupelocom@gmail.com. The UUC of Tupelo is a welcoming congregation who accept all people, regardless of creed, color, national origin, gender, or gender identity. We hope you have enjoyed this podcast, and as you head on your way, go in peace, believe in peace, create peace.